My name is Dr. Nogsy Buckelman, and I never thought a simple Tuesday morning would become the day that changed everything at Cedars Life Hospital. As the CEO of this institution for the past 5 years, I thought I knew my hospital inside and out. But sometimes, you need to see your world through different eyes to truly understand what's happening within your own walls. I had been hearing whispers, complaints from patients, particularly from minority communities, about differential treatment. Board member Patricia Hernandez had brought it to my attention during our last quarterly review. Ngozi, she had said, her voice heavy with concern. We're getting reports that some patients feel they're being treated differently based on their appearance. We need to investigate. The formal complaints were vague, often dismissed by our patient relations team as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. But when you're the first Black woman CEO of a major medical institution, you develop a sixth sense about these things. The pattern was there. I just needed proof. So I devised what I thought would be a simple test. I would visit our emergency department not as Dr. Buckelman, the CEO, but as a regular patient seeking treatment. I left my executive badge at home, dressed in casual clothes, jeans, a simple sweater, and comfortable shoes. No designer handbag, no obvious markers of my position, just me, as any other person might appear when seeking medical care. I had asked my assistant, Rebecca, to reschedule my morning meetings, telling her I had an urgent matter to attend to. I didn't lie, this was urgent. The credibility of our institution, the trust of our community, and the integrity of our mission were all on the line. As I walked through the main entrance of Cedars Life that morning, I felt a strange mixture of nervousness and determination. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the familiar scent of antiseptic mixed with fresh flowers from our lobby arrangements filled my nostrils. But something felt different. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking these halls as someone in charge. I was just another person seeking help. The first sign of trouble came at the information desk. "Excuse me," I said to the receptionist, a young woman named Ashley, whose badge I could see from where I stood. "I need to see someone about some chest pains I've been having." Ashley looked up from her computer screen, and I watched her eyes quickly scan me from head to toe. There was something in that look, a flicker of judgment, perhaps, or assumption. She had smiled warmly at the well-dressed elderly white gentleman who had approached just before me, directing him immediately to the executive health services on the 3rd floor. She said, her tone noticeably flatter than it had been moments before. "You'll need to go to the emergency room. Take the elevator down to B1. Follow the red line on the floor." "Actually," I said, maintaining my composure, "I was hoping to see someone in our executive health services. I have private insurance, and I'd prefer—" "Ma'am," Ashley interrupted, not bothering to look up from her screen this time. "The emergency room is where you need to go. They'll assess you there and determine what level of care you need." It felt the first prickle of what so many of our patients must feel, the assumption that I couldn't afford or didn't deserve the same level of service as others. But I pressed on, knowing this was exactly the experience I needed to document. "Could you please check what options are available to me?" I asked politely. "I'd like to understand all my choices for care." Ashley sighed audibly as if I was being difficult. She picked up her phone and I heard her speak to someone on the other end. "Yeah, I've got someone here insisting on executive services. No, she doesn't look like... she's asking about executive care, but... Okay, I'll send her down to E." She hung up and looked at me with what could only be described as dismissive finality. "Emergency room, B1, they'll take care of you there." As I walked toward the elevator, I noticed other staff members' eyes following me. I was no stranger to being the only Black face in professional settings, but this felt different. Here in my own hospital, I was experiencing the invisible barriers that our patients had been trying to tell us about. The elevator doors closed, and I saw my reflection in the polished steel. Same face, same intelligence, same medical degree from Johns Hopkins, same 5 years of leadership that had brought this hospital back from near bankruptcy to being ranked among the top medical centers in the region. But today, none of that seemed to matter. I pulled out my phone and on impulse opened the live streaming app that my teenage niece had shown me the previous weekend. If I was going to document this experience, I might as well do it in real time. Maybe having witnesses would ensure that whatever happened next would be taken seriously. "Hey everyone," I said quietly into the phone as the elevator descended. "I'm about to conduct what you might call a real-world test of my own hospital services. I'm not going to say much more right now, but I hope you'll stay with me to see how this plays out." I had no idea that within the next 2 hours, nearly 50,000 people would be watching. The emergency room was bustling with its usual controlled chaos. Nurses moved efficiently between patients, monitors beeped steadily, and the familiar sounds of urgent medical care filled the air. As someone who had spent years in these environments, first as a resident, then as an attending physician, and finally as an administrator, I felt at home here. But today, I was seeing it from an entirely different perspective. I approached the triage desk where Nurse Janet Williams sat. I had personally hired Janet 3 years ago, and she was known for her exceptional patient care. I was curious to see how she would treat me without knowing who I was. "Hi," I said. "I've been having some chest pains and shortness of breath. I'd like to be seen by a physician." Janet looked up and smiled, a professional, warm smile that immediately put me at ease. This was more like the standard I expected at Cedars Life. "Of course, honey. Let me get some basic information from you." She pulled out a clipboard with forms. "Have you been to Cedars Life before?" "No," I lied. "This is my first time here." "Well, welcome. We'll take good care of you." Janet's warmth felt genuine, and for a moment I wondered if my earlier experience was just an isolated incident with one poorly trained receptionist. But then Janet's supervisor, a man I recognized as David Rodriguez, the assistant manager of emergency services, approached the desk. I had worked with David on several policy initiatives. He was competent, professional, and I had never had any reason to question his judgment. Until today. "Janet," David said, his voice low but not low enough to prevent me from hearing, "we need to prioritize the waiting room. Mrs. Patterson is waiting to be seen, and she's been here for 20 minutes. Janet glanced at her computer. "Mrs. Patterson checked in after this lady, David. I'm following protocol." David's eyes flicked to me, and I saw that same quick assessment I had received from Ashley upstairs. "Protocol," he said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, "also includes making sure we're using our resources efficiently. Why don't you have her wait, and we'll get to her when we have an opening." "But she's presenting with chest pain," Janet protested. "That's priority level 2. Mrs. Patterson is here for a routine follow-up." The conversation was happening right in front of me, as if I wasn't even there. I felt my phone vibrating with notifications. People were joining the live stream, commenting, asking questions. I had positioned the phone so that it could capture the conversation without being obvious. "Janet," David said, his tone now carrying the weight of his authority, "I'll handle the triage decisions. Please have her take a seat in the waiting area." I watched Janet's face change. The warmth was still there, but it was now mixed with something else. Confusion, maybe even embarrassment. She handed me the clipboard with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, miss. Please fill these out and take a seat. We'll call you when we're ready." I accepted the clipboard and walked to the waiting area, my phone still recording. As I sat down, I noticed Mrs. Patterson, a well-dressed white woman in her 60s, who was chatting pleasantly with her husband about their upcoming cruise. She didn't look like someone experiencing a medical emergency. The waiting room was a microcosm of our community: elderly patients, young families, people from all walks of life. And as I watched, I began to notice patterns I had never seen from my executive-level perspective. The speed with which different patients were called back seemed to correlate with factors that had nothing to do with the severity of their conditions. I completed the paperwork listing my occupation as consultant and providing the insurance information for a secondary policy I maintained. Everything was legitimate, but I was careful not to include any information that might immediately identify me as the hospital's CEO. As I waited, I watched David moving through the area, and I noticed how his demeanor changed depending on who he was speaking with. With Mrs. Patterson, he was deferential, almost apologetic about the wait. With a young Hispanic mother holding a feverish toddler, he was efficient but distant. With an elderly black man who was clearly in some discomfort, he was barely present at all. My phone buzzed with a message from someone watching the stream. "Are you documenting discrimination? This is powerful stuff." I hadn't explicitly said what I was doing, but viewers were drawing their own conclusions. The comments were coming in faster now, people sharing their own experiences with healthcare discrimination, others expressing disbelief that this kind of treatment still happened. After an hour, I was still waiting. Mrs. Patterson had been called back 30 minutes ago. 2 other patients who had arrived after me had also been seen. The young mother with the sick child was still waiting too, and I could see her growing anxiety as her daughter's fever seemed to be worsening. I decided it was time to escalate. I approached David at the nurse's station. my phone still discreetly recording. By now, the live stream had over 3,000 viewers, and the comments were a mix of outrage, support, and people sharing their own similar experiences. "Excuse me," I said to David. "I've been waiting for over an hour with chest pain symptoms. Could you please tell me what the holdup is?" David looked up from his computer with visible irritation. "Ma'am, we see patients based on the severity of their conditions and available resources. You'll be called when we're ready for you." "I understand that," I replied, keeping my voice calm and professional, "but I've watched several people who arrived after me be seen before me. I'm trying to understand the triage process here. Are you questioning our medical judgment?" David's voice was rising now, attracting the attention of other staff members and patients in the area. "I'm simply asking for clarification about how patients are prioritized," I said. As someone with chest pain, I would have expected to be seen relatively quickly. "Look," David said, standing up from his chair and crossing his arms, "I don't know what you think you know about how hospitals work, but we have protocols here, and those protocols don't involve patients telling us how to do our jobs." I felt the weight of the moment. This was exactly the kind of interaction that patients had been complaining about: the dismissive attitude, the assumption that questioning the system was somehow inappropriate, the subtle but unmistakable suggestion that I didn't belong in a position to question anything. "I'm not telling you how to do your job," I said, my voice steady despite the growing tension. "I'm advocating for appropriate medical care, which I believe is my right as a patient." "Your right?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lady, your rights are to wait your turn like everyone else. And if you don't like how we do things here, you're free to go to another hospital." The comment section of my live stream was exploding. Viewers were screenshot the interaction, sharing it on other platforms and expressing their outrage at what they were witnessing. Some were even starting to identify Cedars Life Hospital based on visible signage in the background. "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse, "I'd like to speak with your supervisor about the level of service I'm receiving here." "I am the supervisor on duty," David replied smugly, "and I'm telling you that if you continue to be disruptive, we'll have to ask you to leave." "Disruptive?" I couldn't keep the disbelief out of my voice. "I'm asking about medical care for chest pain symptoms. How is that disruptive?" "Ma'am," came a new voice from behind me. I turned to see two security guards approaching. I recognized them both, Tom Bradley and James Foster, both of whom I had personally commended for their professionalism in previous incidents. "We're going to need you to lower your voice and return to the waiting area." "Gentlemen," I said, looking directly at them, "I'm simply trying to understand why I haven't been seen for chest pain symptoms after waiting over an hour." Tom, the senior guard, looked uncomfortable. I could see in his eyes that he recognized something wasn't right about the situation, but he was following orders. "Ma'am, we understand your frustration, but causing a scene isn't going to help anyone. Why don't you come with us and we can talk about this calmly?" The live stream viewers were now numbering in the thousands, and I could see people tagging local news outlets in the comments. Someone had started a hashtag, #MyTearsLifeDiscrimination. "I'm not causing a scene," I said, my voice still calm but carrying the authority I had developed over years of leadership. "I'm requesting appropriate medical care, but I'm starting to understand that there might be other factors influencing how that care is being allocated." David's face was flushed now. "Other factors? What exactly are you implying?" It was time. I could continue this charade and probably gather more evidence, but I could see that the situation was escalating to a point where it might become counterproductive. More importantly, I realized that I had already gathered more than enough evidence of the systemic issues we were facing. I looked directly into my phone camera, knowing that thousands of people were watching in real time. "What I'm implying," I said, my voice carrying across the emergency department, "is that there seems to be a significant disparity in how patients are being treated here. And as the CEO of this hospital, I find that completely unacceptable." The silence that followed was deafening. The emergency department seemed to freeze. David's mouth fell open, Tom and James stepped back, and I could see Janet at the triage desk covering her mouth with her hand. The patients in the waiting area were all staring, and several staff members had stopped what they were doing to witness the unfolding scene. "What did you just say?" David whispered, his face now pale. I reached into my purse and pulled out my hospital ID badge, the one with my photo, title, and the CEO designation clearly visible. I held it up so everyone could see, including the thousands of people watching the live stream. I said, "I'm Dr. Ngozi Buckelman, CEO of Cedars Life Hospital, and for the past 2 hours I've been experiencing firsthand the discrimination that our patients have been reporting to us for months. The live stream comments were moving so fast I couldn't read them, but I could see expressions of shock, vindication, and calls for action scrolling by in a blur. David looked like he might faint. Dr. Buckelman, I had no idea. I mean, if I had known. That's exactly the point, David, I said, my voice now carrying the full weight of my authority. If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently. But every patient who walks through these doors deserves the same level of respect and care, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Tom and James had backed away, clearly mortified at having been called to intimidate their own CEO. Janet had left the triage desk and was walking toward us, tears in her eyes. Dr. Buckelman, Janet said, her voice shaking, I am so sorry. I tried to follow protocol, but— Janet, I said gently, you did nothing wrong. You followed proper triage procedures. The problem isn't with our protocols, it's with how they're being implemented, and who gets to decide when they apply. I turned to address David directly. In my office, tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., we need to have a very serious conversation about what happened here today and what it means for your future with this organization. David nodded mutely, clearly understanding that his career at Cedars Life was likely over. But I wasn't done. I looked around the emergency department, knowing that this moment was being witnessed not just by the staff present, but by thousands of people online who were sharing and commenting on what they had seen. I want everyone here to understand something, I said, my voice carrying across the department. What happened here today wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systemic issues that we've allowed to persist in our institution, issues that affect real people who come here in their most vulnerable moments, seeking help and trusting us to provide it without judgment or discrimination. I turned back to my phone, addressing the live stream audience directly. To everyone who has been watching this, thank you for bearing witness to what our patients experience when they don't have the privilege of being CEO. Your presence here, your comments, and your willingness to share this story are part of what will make the changes that need to happen possible. The notifications on my phone were constant now. News outlets, patient advocacy groups, and individuals were sharing the stream across social media platforms. The hashtag #ZedarsLifeDiscrimination was trending, and I could see that the story was beginning to be picked up by local news. I ended the live stream and turned to Janet, who was still standing nearby with tears in her eyes. Janet, I want you to know that you handled this situation professionally. The fault here isn't with our frontline staff who are trying to do their jobs under difficult circumstances. The fault is with leadership, including me, for not ensuring that our values are consistently reflected in our practices. Within 30 minutes of ending the live stream, my phone was ringing constantly. Rebecca, my assistant, was calling to tell me that the hospital's main line was flooded with calls from media outlets. Board Chair Patricia Hernandez was trying to reach me. The hospital's public relations director was in full crisis mode. But first, I had some immediate business to take care of in the emergency department. I found the young Hispanic mother still waiting with her feverish daughter and personally ensured that they were seen immediately by our pediatric emergency physician. The elderly black man, who had been waiting even longer than I had, was brought back for evaluation right away. I spent a few minutes with each patient, apologizing personally for the delays and ensuring they received the care they needed. As word spread through the hospital that I was in the emergency department, staff members began appearing, some curious, others clearly nervous. I decided to address them directly. Gathering the available emergency department staff, I stood in the center of the department and spoke from the heart. I know that what happened here today is shocking, and I know that many of you are confused, upset, or worried about what this means. Let me be clear. Our mission at Cedars Life Hospital is to provide excellent medical care to all patients regardless of their race, gender, socioeconomic status, or any other factor. Today, we failed to live up to that mission. I could see nods and murmurs of agreement throughout the group. But failure can be a teacher if we're willing to learn from it. What I experienced today, what thousands of people witnessed online, is going to be the catalyst for meaningful change at this institution. Not cosmetic changes, not policy adjustments that sound good on paper, but don't change reality. Real substantive transformation. Dr. Sarah Kim, our emergency department director, stepped forward. I had worked closely with Sarah over the years, and I respected her clinical expertise and leadership. Dr. Buckelman, she said, I want you to know that what happened today doesn't represent the values of our department or our staff. We're committed to providing equitable care to all patients. I know that, Sarah, I replied. And I want to be clear that this isn't about pointing fingers at individuals or departments. This is about acknowledging that we have systemic issues that need to be addressed at every level of our organization. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Hernandez. Emergency board meeting called for 6 p.m. today. Media is requesting statements. We need to talk immediately. I looked at the assembled staff. Over the next few weeks, you're going to see significant changes here. We're going to be implementing new training programs, revising our policies, and most importantly, creating accountability mechanisms to ensure that what happened today never happens again. I need each of you to be part of that solution. As I prepared to leave the emergency department to deal with the growing media storm, Janet approached me one more time. "Dr. Buckelman," she said quietly, "thank you for doing this. I've seen things that bothered me, but I never felt like I had the power to speak up about them. Maybe now things will actually change." "Janet," I said, "frontline staff like you are the heart of this institution. Your voice matters, and moving forward, we're going to create formal channels for you to be heard when you see problems. No one should have to stay silent when they witness discrimination or inequitable treatment." By 3 p.m., the hospital's parking lot was filled with news vans. The live stream had been viewed over 100,000 times and shared across multiple social media platforms. Cedars Life Discrimination was the top trending hashtag in our metropolitan area, and the story was being picked up by national news outlets. I had changed into professional attire and was in my executive office, which suddenly felt both familiar and foreign after the morning's experience. Rebecca had cleared my schedule and was fielding a constant stream of calls from reporters, patient advocacy groups, and medical organizations. Patricia Hernandez arrived first, her usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious stress. "Ngozi," she said as she entered my office. "In 20 years of serving on hospital boards, I've never seen anything like this. The phones haven't stopped ringing. CNN wants a statement. The American Medical Association is asking questions, and our own staff is in chaos." "Good," I said, surprising her with my response. "Good?" Patricia stared at me. "Ngozi, this could destroy the hospital's reputation. Our patient volume could plummet. We could face lawsuits. The board is in full panic mode." I leaned back in my chair, the same chair I had sat in hundreds of times before, but everything felt different now. "Patricia, our reputation should be destroyed if we've been systematically discriminating against patients. Our patient volume should plummet if we're not providing equitable care. And we should face consequences if we've been violating people's rights. The panic you're seeing isn't about the live stream, it's about the truth being exposed." Patricia sat down across from me, her expression shifting from panic to something closer to understanding. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said. I walked her through the entire experience, from the dismissive treatment at the information desk to the confrontation in the emergency department. As I spoke, I could see her face change from concern about public relations to genuine horror at what I had experienced. "My God, Ngozi, in your own hospital." "Exactly. And if they treated me that way, someone who admittedly they didn't recognize but who was well-dressed, articulate, and insured, imagine how they treat patients who don't have those advantages." My phone buzzed with another call. Rebecca's voice came through the intercom. "Dr. Buckelman, I have Channel 7 News on line 1, the Washington Post on line 2, and the CEO of Metropolitan General Hospital wants to speak with you about setting up a regional task force on healthcare equity." Patricia looked at me with something approaching admiration. "You planned this, didn't you?" The live stream, the documentation, this wasn't just a spontaneous test. "I planned to investigate reports of discrimination," I said. "I didn't plan for it to be this blatant or this widely witnessed. But you're right, I documented everything because I knew that without proof, nothing would change. Complaints get filed away, policies get written and ignored, but when 50,000 people watch discrimination happen in real time, that creates accountability." The emergency board meeting was unlike any I had ever attended. All 7 board members were present, along with our legal counsel, public relations director, and chief medical officer. The tension in the room was palpable. Board member William Stevens spoke first, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, though I wasn't immediately sure if his anger was directed at the discrimination or at my decision to expose it publicly. "Ngozi, what you did today has put this institution in an impossible position. We're facing a public relations nightmare, potential legal liability, and a very real possibility of regulatory investigations. Did you consider any of these consequences before you decided to conduct the experiment. I'd expected this reaction from Stevens, who had always been more concerned with the hospital's financial bottom line than its social mission. William, I replied calmly, the impossible position we're in is entirely of our own making. I didn't create discrimination at Cedars Life. I exposed it, and yes, I considered the consequences very carefully. I also considered the consequences of allowing systematic mistreatment of our patients to continue unchecked. Dr. Amanda Foster, our board's physician representative, leaned forward. But Nosy, couldn't this have been handled internally, through HR investigations, policy reviews, staff retraining? Did it have to be so public? Amanda, I said, we've been handling discrimination complaints internally for years. How has that worked out? We've had sensitivity training sessions, policy revisions, and human resources investigations. But the patterns continued because there were no real consequences and no external accountability. Patricia, who had been quiet since the meeting began, finally spoke up. I asked Ngozi to investigate these reports because our internal processes weren't working. The formal complaint process was clearly inadequate if patients were still experiencing discrimination. Legal counsel Robert Shin. Damn, I had to catch myself using a name I'd said to avoid. Our legal advisor Robert Williams cleared his throat. From a liability standpoint, we need to consider that the live stream could be used as evidence in potential lawsuits. We've essentially documented our own discriminatory practices. Good, I said again, earning surprised looks from around the table. If we've been discriminating against patients, we should face legal consequences. And more importantly, we should fix the problems that created the discrimination in the first place. Board member Jennifer Thompson, who represented our community outreach committee, nodded slowly. Ngozi's right. We've been getting complaints for months, and our response has been inadequate. Maybe it took something this dramatic to force us to take real action. Stevens wasn't giving up, but the financial implications of discrimination lawsuits would be far worse than the costs of implementing real solutions. I interrupted. More importantly, we have a moral obligation to provide equitable care. If we can't do that, we don't deserve to operate. The room fell silent. Finally, Patricia spoke again. What are you proposing, Ngozi? I had spent the afternoon thinking about this question, knowing it would be central to the board's response. Complete organizational transformation, I said. Not incremental changes or cosmetic adjustments. Comprehensive restructuring of our policies, procedures, training programs, and accountability mechanisms. I stood and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the conference room. First, immediate suspension and investigation of all staff involved in today's incident. Second, implementation of bias training for all employees, not just clinical staff. Third, creation of an external patient advocacy board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend consequences. I continued writing on the board as I spoke. Fourth, revision of all triage and patient care protocols to eliminate subjective decision-making that could be influenced by bias. Fifth, regular testing, both announced and unannounced, of our systems to ensure compliance. And sixth, full transparency about our efforts, including public reporting of discrimination complaints and our responses to them. Stevens looked horrified. You're talking about completely reorganizing how we operate. The costs would be enormous, and the disruption to our operations could be catastrophic. William, I said, turning to face him directly, the disruption to our operations has already happened. It happened the moment I ended that live stream with 50,000 people watching. Now we can either be proactive in addressing the problems, or we can be reactive to investigations, lawsuits, and regulatory actions. Dr. Foster raised another concern. What about staff morale? If we come down too hard on the people involved in today's incident, it could create a climate of fear. Fear of what? I asked. Fear of being held accountable for discriminatory behavior? That's exactly the climate we need to create. Our staff should understand that discrimination has consequences. Jennifer Thompson spoke up again. I think we need to be careful to distinguish between individual accountability and systemic change. Today's incident involved specific individuals making specific choices, but it also revealed institutional failures that we all bear responsibility for. She was right, and I appreciated her perspective. Absolutely, I agreed. We're not looking for scapegoats. We're looking for comprehensive solutions. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be individual consequences for discriminatory behavior. Over the next 2 hours, we developed what we called the Cedars Life Equity Initiative, a comprehensive plan to address the discriminatory practices that had been exposed by the day's events. The plan had several key components. Immediate actions: David Rodriguez would be terminated, effective immediately. The security guards would be suspended pending further investigation and required to complete intensive bias training before returning to work. Ashley, the receptionist, would be required to complete bias training and would be moved to a position with less patient interaction while her performance was monitored. Training and education: all hospital employees, from executives to maintenance staff, would be required to complete comprehensive bias awareness and cultural competency training within 30 days. This wouldn't be a one-time session, but an ongoing program with regular refresher courses and updates. Policy revision: all patient care protocols would be reviewed and revised to eliminate subjective criteria that could be influenced by bias. Triage procedures would be standardized with clear, objective criteria for prioritizing patients. Accountability mechanisms: we would establish an external patient equity board composed of community representatives, civil rights advocates, and healthcare professionals from other institutions. This board would have the authority to investigate discrimination complaints and recommend disciplinary actions. Testing and monitoring: we would implement regular mystery patient programs to test our systems and identify problems before they escalated. We would also establish real-time monitoring of patient flow patterns to identify potential disparities in care. Transparency and reporting: we would publish quarterly reports on discrimination complaints, our investigations, and the actions taken in response. These reports would be made available to the public and to regulatory agencies. Community engagement: we would establish formal partnerships with community organizations, particularly those representing minority populations, to ensure ongoing feedback about our services and to build trust with communities that had been underserved. Stevens continued to express concerns about the costs and complexity of the plan. This is going to require hiring additional staff, implementing new systems, and completely restructuring our operations. We're talking about millions of dollars in costs and months of disruption. William, Patricia said firmly, the cost of not doing this would be far higher. We could face federal investigations, lose our accreditation, and destroy our reputation permanently. More importantly, we have a moral obligation to provide equitable care. Legal counsel, Williams raised his hand. I need to point out that implementing these changes will also strengthen our legal position if we do face discrimination lawsuits. Courts look favorably on institutions that take proactive steps to address problems. As the meeting continued, I could see the board members gradually shifting from panic and resistance to acceptance and even enthusiasm for the plan. The moral argument was compelling, but the practical benefits were also becoming clear. Dr. Foster made an important point. If we do this right, we could become a model for other hospitals. Instead of being known for discrimination, we could be known for leading the fight against healthcare inequity. Exactly, I said. This crisis could become our greatest opportunity to demonstrate real leadership in healthcare equity. By the end of the meeting, the board had unanimously approved the Cedars Life Equity Initiative. The vote wasn't just about crisis management. It was a commitment to fundamental change. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital to find protesters gathered outside the main entrance. But these weren't angry protesters demanding my resignation. They were supporters holding signs reading "Thank you, Dr. Buckelman," and "Healthcare Equity Now." Inside, the atmosphere was tense but energized. Word of the previous day's events and the board's response had spread throughout the hospital, creating a mix of anxiety, embarrassment, and determination among staff members. I had scheduled an all-staff meeting for 10 a.m., but first I wanted to visit the emergency department to see how things were operating. Janet was at the triage desk again, and she looked up nervously as I approached. "Good morning, Janet. How are things going today?" "Dr. Buckelman," she said, her voice still showing the strain of the previous day's events. "I want you to know that everyone here is talking about what happened. Some people are upset, but a lot of us are actually relieved that these issues are finally being addressed." She lowered her voice. "There have been things that bothered me for a long time, but I never felt like I could speak up about them. Yesterday changed that." "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear," I said. "Change is never easy, but it's necessary, and I need staff like you to be part of the solution." As I walked through the department, I noticed subtle but significant changes. Staff members were being more deliberate in their interactions with patients, more conscious of their language and behavior. The changes weren't dramatic. They were the kind of adjustments you make when you know you're being watched and held accountable. Dr. Sarah Kim approached me near the nurses' station. "Ngozi, She said, "I've been thinking about yesterday, and I want you to know that I support what you did. It was brave and it was necessary, but I also want to talk about how we move forward from here." "I'm listening," I said. "My staff is nervous. They're worried about making mistakes, about being judged unfairly, about having their careers destroyed over misunderstandings. How do we create accountability without creating a climate of fear?" It was a fair question, and one I had been grappling with myself. "Sarah, accountability doesn't mean punishment for honest mistakes or misunderstandings. It means consequences for deliberate discriminatory behavior and systems that perpetuate inequity. Your staff should feel supported in providing excellent care to all patients, not fearful of doing their jobs." I paused, thinking about how to frame this properly. What they should fear is treating patients differently based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status. What they should fear is making assumptions about who deserves what level of care. Those aren't honest mistakes. Those are choices that have serious consequences for people's health and dignity. Sarah nodded slowly. "I think what my team needs is clarity about expectations and support in meeting them. The training programs you've outlined will help, but they also need to know that good faith efforts to provide equitable care will be recognized and supported." "Absolutely. And Sarah, I want you to know that what happened yesterday wasn't a reflection of failures in your department specifically. It was a symptom of institutional problems that we all contributed to through our inaction." The all-staff meeting was held in our main auditorium, with overflow seating in conference rooms connected by video link. Nearly 800 employees attended, the largest staff gathering in the hospital's history. As I took the podium, I could see a sea of faces reflecting every emotion imaginable: curiosity, anxiety, shame, determination, and hope. "Good morning, everyone. I know that yesterday's events have created a lot of uncertainty and concern, so I want to address what happened, what it means, and where we go from here." The room was absolutely silent. "First, I want to acknowledge that what you witnessed either in person or through the media coverage was deeply disturbing. The discriminatory treatment I experienced as a patient is unacceptable under any circumstances, but it was particularly troubling because it revealed systematic problems in how we serve our community." I could see nods throughout the audience, along with some uncomfortable shifting in seats. "I also want to be clear about something. This is not about blaming individuals or departments. What happened yesterday was the result of institutional failures that we all bear responsibility for. We created systems and cultures that allowed discrimination to flourish, and now we have an opportunity to create something better." Dr. Williams, one of our senior attending physicians, raised his hand. "Dr. Buckelman, how do we know that what happened yesterday represents a pattern and not just an isolated incident with a few bad actors?" It was a question I had expected, and one that deserved a thorough answer. "Dr. Williams, over the past 6 months, we've received 47 formal complaints about discriminatory treatment from patients. Of those, 38 involved patients from minority communities, reporting that they felt they received different treatment based on their race or ethnicity. Our standard response has been to file these complaints, conduct brief investigations that rarely substantiated the claims, and implement minor policy adjustments that didn't address the underlying issues." The room was still silent, but I could sense the weight of this information settling over the audience. Yesterday's experience confirmed what these patients have been trying to tell us. There are systematic disparities in how we treat people, and those disparities are having real impacts on health outcomes and community trust. Nurse Patricia Johnson, who had worked at Cedars Life for over 15 years, stood up in the back of the auditorium. "Dr. Buckelman," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I want to thank you for doing what you did yesterday. I've seen things over the years that bothered me, but I never felt like I had a voice or that anyone would listen if I spoke up. Maybe now that will change." Her comment prompted murmurs of agreement throughout the room, and I could see other staff members nodding. "Patricia, that's exactly why we need to change, not just our policies, but our culture. Every employee at Cedars Life should feel empowered to speak up when they see problems, and they should know that their concerns will be taken seriously and acted upon." Not everyone was supportive of the changes we were implementing. Over the next few days, I received several anonymous letters criticizing my publicity stunt and suggesting that I had damaged the hospital's reputation for personal gain. Some staff members were clearly uncomfortable with the increased scrutiny and accountability measures. But for every critic, there were 2 or 3 supporters. Patients began reaching out to share their own experiences with discrimination at Cedars Life and other healthcare institutions. Community leaders praised the hospital's response and offered to partner with us on the equity initiative. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, our chief of cardiology, requested a meeting with me 3 days after the incident.
Ngozi, she said as she entered my office, I need to tell you something that I should have told you months ago.
I gestured for her to sit down, noting the serious expression on her face. I've been keeping informal notes on patient outcomes in our cardiac unit, broken down by race and ethnicity. The patterns are disturbing. She pulled out a folder and spread several charts across my desk. Black patients with heart attacks wait an average of 23 minutes longer for treatment than white patients with similar symptoms. Hispanic patients are 40% less likely to receive the most advanced cardiac interventions, even when their insurance coverage is identical to white patients. I studied the charts, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and determination. How long have you known about this? I started noticing patterns about 8 months ago, but it took me this long to compile enough data to be sure. I kept telling myself it was probably just coincidental, or that there were other factors I wasn't seeing. Angela, why didn't you bring this to me sooner? She looked uncomfortable. Honestly, I was afraid. Afraid that you would think I was making trouble. Afraid that other physicians would ostracize me for questioning their clinical judgment. Afraid that nothing would change even if I did speak up. And what changed your mind? Yesterday, she said simply, watching you put your own reputation and career on the line to expose these problems made me realize that I had been complicit in perpetuating them through my silence. Angela's data was damning, but it was also exactly the kind of evidence we needed to demonstrate the scope of the problems we were facing. More importantly, her willingness to come forward suggested that the culture of silence that had protected discriminatory practices was beginning to break down. Angela, I want you to present this data to the board at next week's meeting. We need to understand the full extent of the disparities in our care, and we need to develop specific interventions to address them. Are you sure? This kind of information could expose us to significant legal liability. The legal liability already exists, I said. What we're doing now is creating a paper trail that shows we're taking proactive steps to address the problems. That will actually strengthen our legal position in the long run. Over the following week, more staff members came forward with similar concerns. Nurses reported observing differences in how pain medication was prescribed based on patient race. Laboratory technicians noticed that certain tests were ordered more frequently for white patients than for minority patients with similar symptoms. Administrative staff shared examples of how insurance verification processes seemed to be more rigorous for patients of color. Each revelation was troubling, but collectively they painted a picture of systemic discrimination that was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The story of what happened at Cedars Life had now been covered by every major news network. The original live stream had been viewed over 500,000 times, and Cedars Life discrimination had become a national conversation starter about healthcare equity. I was invited to appear on several national news programs to discuss the incident and our response. Initially, I was reluctant to accept these invitations, concerned that they might sensationalize the story or distract from the real work of institutional change. But Patricia convinced me that the media attention could be valuable in holding us accountable and encouraging other institutions to examine their own practices. My appearance on Morning America was particularly impactful. Host Jennifer Walsh asked the question that many people were wondering about. Dr. Buckelman, some critics have suggested that your decision to live stream this experience was a publicity stunt designed to generate attention for yourself or the hospital. How do you respond to that? I had been prepared for this question, but I still felt the weight of it. Jennifer, if I wanted positive publicity for myself or the hospital, staging a discrimination incident and broadcasting it to thousands of people would be the worst possible strategy. What happened that day was humiliating, painful, and damaging to our institution's reputation, but it was also necessary. I leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. The patients who had been complaining about discriminatory treatment didn't have the privilege of being believed without proof. They didn't have the authority to implement changes. They didn't have platforms to share their experiences. So I used my privilege and my platform to document what they had been experiencing, knowing that it would create the accountability and urgency needed to drive real change. The interview seemed to resonate with viewers. Within hours, Believe Patients was trending on social media, with people sharing their own experiences with healthcare discrimination and praising Cedars Life for its response to the crisis. But the media attention also brought scrutiny of our reform efforts. Reporters were asking tough questions about whether our changes were substantive or cosmetic, whether we would sustain our commitment to equity over time, and whether other hospitals would follow our lead. Dr. Michael Thompson, a healthcare equity researcher at Johns Hopkins, was interviewed for a follow-up story about our reforms. His comments were both encouraging and challenging. What Cedars Life is doing represents the most comprehensive response to healthcare discrimination that I've seen from a major medical institution. But the real test will be whether these changes persist after the media attention fades, and whether they actually improve health outcomes for minority patients. His comment reminded me that we were still in the early stages of a long-term transformation. The policies and procedures we had implemented were just the beginning. The real work would be sustaining and deepening these changes over months and years. 6 months after the live stream incident, we conducted our first comprehensive review of the Cedars Life Equity Initiative. The results were both encouraging and sobering. On the positive side, patient satisfaction scores among minority patients had increased significantly. Complaint rates about discriminatory treatment had dropped by 60%. Wait times for emergency care showed no statistically significant differences based on patient race or ethnicity. Staff completion rates for bias training were at 98%. But we also discovered areas where our progress was slower than hoped. Disparities in pain management and cardiac care, while reduced, still existed. Some staff members were going through the motions of equity training without genuinely changing their attitudes or behaviors, and we had lost several employees who were uncomfortable with the increased accountability measures. Angela Rodriguez, who had become our unofficial champion for clinical equity, presented her latest data analysis to the board. "We've made significant progress in some areas," she reported, "but we still have work to do. The good news is that the disparities we're seeing now are much smaller than they were 6 months ago, and we have systems in place to continue monitoring and addressing them." Board member Jennifer Thompson asked the question that was on everyone's mind: are these changes sustainable? What happens when the media attention fades and the community pressure decreases? It was a fair concern. Reform efforts in healthcare institutions often lose momentum over time, particularly when they require ongoing resources and attention. "That's exactly why we built external accountability into our system," I responded. "The Patient Equity Board isn't going anywhere. The quarterly public reporting isn't going anywhere. The mystery patient program isn't going anywhere. We've created structures that will maintain pressure for continuous improvement even when the initial crisis is forgotten." Patricia Hernandez, who had become one of our strongest advocates for the Equity Initiative, added her perspective. "We've also seen that these changes have benefits beyond just addressing discrimination. Our overall patient satisfaction scores are up, our staff retention has improved, and our reputation in the community is stronger than it's ever been." She was right. The initial crisis had damaged our reputation, but our response to it had ultimately strengthened it. We were now seen as a hospital that took patient concerns seriously and was willing to make difficult changes to address problems. Perhaps the most gratifying aspect of our experience was seeing other healthcare institutions begin to implement similar programs. Within a year of the live stream incident, over 50 hospitals across the country had contacted us asking for guidance on implementing their own equity initiatives. The American Hospital Association invited me to keynote their annual conference on the topic of healthcare equity. In my speech, I emphasized that addressing discrimination wasn't just a moral imperative, it was also good business. "Discriminatory practices don't just harm patients," I told the audience of hospital executives. "They harm institutions. They reduce patient satisfaction, increase legal liability, damage community relationships, and waste resources. Equity isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do." After the speech, I was approached by Dr. Rebecca Santos, the CEO of Metropolitan General Hospital, one of our primary competitors. "Ngozi," she said, "I have to admit that when your story first broke, my board's initial reaction was that we should capitalize on your PR crisis to attract patients away from Cedars Life. But watching how you've handled this situation has made us realize that we need to examine our own practices." Rebecca, that's exactly the kind of conversation we need to be having across the healthcare industry. This isn't about competitive advantage. It's about fulfilling our fundamental mission to provide excellent care to all patients. 6 months later, Metropolitan General announced their own comprehensive equity initiative, based largely on the model we had developed at Cedars Life. Within 2 years, healthcare equity initiatives had become standard practice among major medical institutions in our region. The ripple effects extended beyond healthcare. Local businesses began examining their own practices for discriminatory patterns. The city government launched a comprehensive review of equity in municipal services. Community organizations that had been working on civil rights issues for decades suddenly found themselves with new resources and institutional support. Looking back on that Tuesday morning when I walked into my own hospital as an anonymous patient, I'm struck by how much has changed not just at Cedars Life, but in my own understanding of leadership and institutional responsibility. Before that day, I thought I was a good CEO who cared about equity and inclusion. I had implemented diversity programs, hired minority staff, and spoken at conferences about the importance of cultural competency in healthcare. But I had never truly understood the lived experience of discrimination that our patients faced every day. The live stream wasn't just about documenting discrimination, it was about forcing myself and our institution to confront uncomfortable truths that we had been avoiding. It was about recognizing that good intentions aren't enough if they don't translate into equitable outcomes. One of the most important lessons I learned was the power of transparency and accountability. For years, we had been addressing discrimination complaints through internal processes that allowed problems to be minimized, explained away, or forgotten. But when discrimination happens in front of 50,000 witnesses, there's no way to minimize or ignore it. The external accountability mechanisms we implemented, the Patient Equity Board, the public reporting, the Mystery Patient Program, weren't just about monitoring our progress. They were about ensuring that the pressure for continuous improvement would persist even when the initial crisis faded from memory. I also learned about the importance of creating safe spaces for staff to report problems and suggest solutions. Some of our most effective interventions came from frontline employees who had been observing discriminatory patterns for months or years, but had never felt empowered to speak up about them. Janet, the triage nurse who had tried to follow proper protocols during my emergency department visit, became one of our most effective equity champions. She helped design new triage procedures that eliminated subjective decision-making and created clearer pathways for patient advocacy. Angela Rodriguez, the cardiologist who had been quietly documenting disparities in cardiac care, became the chair of our clinical equity committee and helped develop interventions that significantly reduced racial disparities in treatment outcomes. These staff members didn't need to be convinced that equity was important. They needed to be empowered to act on their convictions and supported when they spoke up about problems. 3 years after the live stream incident, Cedars Life Hospital was recognized by the American Medical Association as a national leader in healthcare equity. We had eliminated statistically significant disparities in emergency care wait times, pain management protocols, and access to advanced treatments. But perhaps more importantly, we had created a culture where equity was seen as integral to excellence rather than separate from it. New employees received comprehensive equity training as part of their orientation. Existing staff participated in ongoing education programs that kept equity at the forefront of their professional development. The Patient Equity Board had become a model for other institutions, composed of community representatives, civil rights advocates, and healthcare professionals. The board provided ongoing oversight of our equity initiatives and served as a direct channel for patient concerns. Our quarterly equity reports, initially implemented as a transparency measure, had evolved into valuable tools for continuous improvement. By tracking patterns in patient care, identifying emerging disparities, and monitoring the effectiveness of our interventions, we were able to address problems before they became crises. The Mystery Patient Program, which initially seemed like an extreme accountability measure, had become a routine part of our quality assurance process. Regular testing of our systems helped us identify training needs, policy gaps, and individual performance issues before they affected patient care. Most importantly, we had fundamentally changed the conversation about healthcare equity in our community. Patients who had previously suffered discrimination in silence now felt empowered to speak up about their experiences. Community organizations that had been marginalized from healthcare decision-making were now active partners in our improvement efforts. The success of our equity initiative attracted attention from healthcare policymakers at the national level. I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on healthcare disparities, where I shared our experience and advocated for federal policies that would support similar initiatives at other institutions. The live stream incident at Cedars Life was not unique, I told the subcommittee members. What was unique was that it happened in public, with thousands of witnesses, in a way that could not be denied or minimized. But discrimination in healthcare happens every day, in institutions across the country, usually without witnesses and without consequences. I went on to describe the systematic changes we had implemented and their impact on patient outcomes and community trust. What we learned is that addressing healthcare discrimination requires more than good intentions or diversity training. It requires systematic changes to policies and procedures, external accountability mechanisms, and sustained commitment from leadership at every level. The hearing led to the introduction of the Healthcare Equity Accountability Act, which would require all hospitals receiving federal funding to implement comprehensive equity monitoring and reporting systems. While the legislation was still working its way through Congress, several states had already enacted similar requirements. The professional associations for hospital administrators, nurses, and physicians had all adopted new standards for equity training and accountability. Medical schools were revising their curricula to include more comprehensive coverage of healthcare disparities and cultural competency. Perhaps most significantly, patient advocacy organizations had gained new credibility and influence in healthcare policy discussions. The viral nature of our live stream had demonstrated the power of social media to create accountability for healthcare institutions, and patients' rights groups were using similar tactics to expose problems at other facilities. Not every aspect of our transformation was smooth or successful. We faced several significant challenges that tested our commitment to equity and forced us to adapt our approaches. About 18 months after the initial incident, we discovered that some staff members were gaming our monitoring systems. They had learned to treat patients more equitably when they suspected they might be dealing with mystery patients, but their behavior reverted to discriminatory patterns when they felt they weren't being watched. This discovery was deeply troubling because it suggested that some employees were complying with our equity requirements out of fear of consequences rather than genuine commitment to equitable care. Dr. Sarah Kim, who had remained as our emergency department director and had become a strong advocate for our equity initiatives, brought this problem to my attention. We're seeing behavioral changes that suggest some staff are treating equity as a performance requirement rather than a professional standard, she reported. They're asking questions like, how can I tell if this is a test patient, instead of how can I provide the best possible care to this patient? This challenge forced us to evolve our approach. Instead of relying solely on external monitoring, we began focusing more on internal motivation and professional development. We implemented peer mentoring programs, created opportunities for staff to share positive experiences with equitable care, and began recognizing and rewarding employees who demonstrated consistent commitment to equity. We also discovered that some of our policies, while well-intentioned, were creating unintended barriers to care. Our efforts to standardize triage procedures had eliminated some discriminatory decision-making, but they had also reduced flexibility for staff to advocate for patients with complex needs. This led to the development of more sophisticated approaches that combined standardized protocols with empowered advocacy. We trained staff to recognize when standard procedures might not be appropriate for particular patients, and gave them clear pathways for escalating concerns and requesting exceptions. As my 5th anniversary as CEO approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that morning when I walked into my own hospital as an anonymous patient. The institution I led was fundamentally different, not just in its policies and procedures, but in its culture and commitment to equity. But I also recognized that the work was far from over. Discrimination in healthcare, like other forms of systemic bias, is persistent and adaptive. As we address obvious forms of discriminatory treatment, more subtle patterns emerge. As we train staff to avoid explicit bias, implicit bias becomes more significant. As we standardize procedures to eliminate discrimination, new forms of inequity develop. This recognition led to what we called our continuous evolution approach to equity. Instead of treating our equity initiative as a program with a defined endpoint, we began to see it as an ongoing process of learning, adaptation, and improvement. We established an annual equity retreat where staff could share experiences, identify emerging challenges, and develop new approaches to persistent problems. We created partnerships with academic researchers who could help us understand the latest developments in healthcare equity and bias reduction. We began participating in national networks of healthcare institutions committed to similar goals. Most importantly, we began developing the next generation of healthcare leaders who would carry this work forward. We created internship programs with local medical schools, nursing programs, and public health programs that focused specifically on healthcare equity. We offered scholarships for students from underrepresented communities who were committed to careers in healthcare leadership. Today, 7 years after the livestream incident that changed everything, I still serve as CEO of Cedars Life Hospital. The institution has been transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable before that Tuesday morning when I experienced discrimination in my own facility. Our patient satisfaction scores are consistently among the highest in the region, with no significant disparities based on race, ethnicity, gender, or socioeconomic status. Our staff retention rates have improved dramatically, and we're now seen as a preferred employer for healthcare professionals who are committed to equity and excellence. We've eliminated measurable disparities in emergency care wait times, pain management protocols, cardiac interventions, and most other clinical areas we monitor. Our Patient Equity Board continues to provide oversight and accountability, and our quarterly public reports continue to demonstrate our ongoing commitment to transparency. But perhaps most importantly, we've created a culture where equity is seen as inseparable from excellence. Our staff understand that providing the best possible care means providing equitable care to all patients. Our leadership development programs ensure that future administrators understand their responsibility to create and maintain equitable systems. The national movement for healthcare equity that was sparked in part by our experience continues to grow. The Healthcare Equity Accountability Act was signed into law 3 years ago, requiring all hospitals receiving federal funding to implement comprehensive equity monitoring and reporting systems. Similar legislation is being considered in other countries. Professional medical associations have adopted new standards for equity training and accountability. Medical schools have revised their curricula to include comprehensive coverage of healthcare disparities and bias reduction. Patient advocacy organizations have gained new influence in healthcare policy discussions. Yet challenges remain. Healthcare disparities persist across the United States and around the world. New forms of discrimination emerge as healthcare technology evolves. Economic pressures on healthcare institutions create ongoing tensions between equity goals and financial constraints. The live stream that started this journey continues to be viewed and shared, serving as a reminder of what healthcare discrimination looks like and what institutional transformation requires. But it's no longer the defining moment of our equity journey, it's simply the beginning of an ongoing commitment to justice, excellence, and the fundamental principle that all patients deserve to be treated with dignity and receive the highest quality care. As I write this, I'm preparing for another mystery patient visit, not because I suspect we're discriminating against patients, but because continuous testing and improvement are now part of how we operate. The work of equity is never finished, but it's work that defines who we are as an institution and as healthcare professionals. The question isn't whether discrimination still exists in healthcare. It does. The question is whether we're willing to confront it honestly, address it systematically, and commit to the ongoing work of creating truly equitable healthcare systems. At Cedars Life Hospital, we've answered that question with our actions, our policies, and our unwavering commitment to the principle that excellent healthcare must be equitable healthcare. The journey continues.